Hey, I'm Cecilia, and here's another video of Come Relax With Me, a title that doesn't really roll off the tongue well, but I'm going with anyways because I couldn't come up with something better. Anyways, let's jump right into this. So today, here is a speed paint of my YouTube and Patreon banner. I've been meaning to change my cover art for both of those places because the previous illustration I put was more of a placeholder for when I got a better drawing. The size and composition of that drawing wasn't good for a cover art, but I didn't have anything better at first because I couldn't think up of something really nice and new. So now I decided was the time to make a proper one. I did not have too many ideas when I first started out, so I just sketched out something I thought could look nice without putting too much thought into it. It was sort of a warm-up rough pass, if you will. It was a sketch of Axel reaching out for May, who's holding Milo, but I didn't like the composition and placing at all, so I decided to make another sketch that I ended up going with in the end. Like most other times when I sketch characters from my comic, I started out by sketching Axel, whom I gave this awkward sort of questioning position, like he has no clue what he's doing there. Next, I did May, who I decided to draw sort of mirroring Axel's body position to balance out the piece. And last, but certainly not least, I drew Milo. Since he is a very happy-go-lucky kid and an almost literal ray of sunshine, I found it fitting to put him in the center of the piece, just being super happy to be there. In retrospect, they sort of look like they're making a heart shape all together like this. I drew a few flowers around them because I found that otherwise the drawing would be way too empty. Since this is a centered piece, I wanted to frame the main subjects nicely with simple elements that don't steal the spotlight away. The flowers I chose to draw are sort of inspired by cherry blossoms. Their shape is easy to simplify to a maximum, and their color is a very light pink, so they were a perfect fit for here. Also, cherry blossoms are just super cute and I love them. When I thought I was done with my second sketch, I tried comparing it with the first one. I wanted to make sure I make the right decision, since this illustration has a more practical purpose than just being a drawing. I could have made any other kind of illustration for my cover art, a simple landscape art, chibi drawings of myself or other things, but I decided to draw these three characters instead because this comic and these characters are the most significant part of my life at the moment. Drawing my comic is the single most interesting thing I do of my everydays at the moment, and it brings me joy when I draw them, and this story is very important to me. It may be a quote-unquote simple little dumb slice of life romance, but this is probably the biggest accomplishment of my life so far, and I want to make sure that I make the best of what I've got. And so, yeah, I drew them. I usually go through 2 or 3 phases of sketches with different levels of detail. Here I made 2 levels of sketches, one to determine the shapes and the position of the characters, and the second one to help with the clothing details and the hair details. For me, it is very important because this gives me more chances to fix obvious mistakes, though I find really admirable the confidence of artists that can jump right into the semi-clean sketch right off the bat. I just can't do that. Well, maybe when I draw like chibi kind of characters, but for bigger scale illustrations, it's just not something I can do. For the clothing choices here, Axel has basically the same shirt he wore in the April Fool's chapter, and Milo is the same as the Cookies chapter, because I found those to be the most iconic clothes in terms of colors for them. I associate Axel a lot with the color green and brown for some reason. I don't know, it just kind of works well with his personality. And Milo is a bright little young boy, so the orange hoodie suits him, I find. For May, I wanted her to wear something more complex and interesting in terms of a top. So I looked up different shirt references, and I thought this kind of elegant, baggy shirt was super nice on her. I decided to keep the rest of her outfit simple, so it doesn't compete with the complexity of her top. Here I started line arting the piece only to realize that I wasn't satisfied with the resolution of the image, so I went and made it bigger. I used a completely arbitrary number honestly, so there's that. I just didn't like how pixelized the line art was. I usually work in very high resolution, so if it's even a little too pixelized, I lose a lot of precision and it's just really frustrating for me. When it comes to chapters, it's the same thing. I always need to format the pages back down to a smaller file size so that I can upload them well. After making this picture bigger, I still thought the resolution was so-so, but I didn't change it again, because I feared that it would be too big and overwhelm Photoshop. During the speed paint, my Photoshop crashed a few times and I've lost some progress. For some reason, out of the blue, Photoshop didn't like it when I recorded more than 10 minutes of footage with my recording software. So, towards like the 3/4 of this video, I switched to a different software and I could record the last 2 hours of footage in almost one go. All in all, this illustration took about 5 hours and 13 minutes to do, spread out on 2-3 days. You will notice me zoom in and out of the piece a lot through this, and all of my next speed paints I do. That's because I always want to make sure that the piece looks just as nice from up close than from afar. Zooming out and seeing the picture as a whole instead of just a segment helps you get a better sense of where you're going with it all and whether the elements fit together well in terms of line arting and especially color. It's also just really satisfying to look back on what you've drawn so far. The way I drew this, it sort of looks like Milo is controlling those swirling petals. And I honestly wouldn't have it any other way. Let the 3-year-old control them elements. When I start coloring in things, I always first block out the elements and give them a base color, the colors in this case being the skin tones of the characters. I then use clipping masks over them to add the diverse other colors on them without having to worry that I go over the outside lines. This can create a lot of layers, but I find it to be the easiest method to color in things. The color choices of this piece were easy, since I was basing them on diverse clothing references that I've either already drawn or that I had found on the internet. When I start coloring in things, I always feel like the colors look a bit weird or uncanny at first, because they don't always feel like they fit well yet, because there isn't any definition in the shadows and highlights yet, so it's all just oddly flat looking. I wanted to create warm shadows for this piece so that it feels soft and inviting. Since I did not have a precise background in mind, I chose to have a pretty generic angle for the source of light, coming at a slight angle from above, like if they were to be lit up with a natural source of light. I always have a separate layer to paint the shadows on the skin that is placed under the clothes layer. It's easier to distinguish between the elements like that, and I can just delete it if I don't like what I've done without disturbing the other colors. I also create another layer to paint the shadows on the clothing elements, hair elements, and whatever other accessory it may be. Sometimes I do the shadows of all of these things on the same layer, and sometimes they get their own separate layer, all depending on the complexity of the drawing and how many effects I want to add. Here I kept most of the shadows and highlights on the same layer. There were only a few times where I wanted to add extra details, but I wasn't sure whether or not I was going to keep them, so I drew them on their own layers. I wanted to vamp things up a bit and tried using a different brush to paint the shadows and highlights. The one I chose to use had a smooth side and a hard side, so I had to change its angle quite often. I wanted to get out of my comfort zone and learn to use a new tool, but it was, well, obviously harder to work with. For certain parts of the shading, I had to go back to my usual soft brush to smoothen out the edges. Doing this exercise made me realize just how many different brushes I have and how few I actually use on a daily basis. It's sort of a shame, really. In the future, I'll try to redo this exercise of trying out new tools. Now, I won't just straight up change the brushes I use for my comic, since those are what I work with the best, and also for the sake of stylistical consistency. But whenever I'll do an illustration, I'll try to mix things up more often and get to use my more forgotten brushes. It will help to challenge myself more often so that I can grow more artistically. Those illustrations might also get video speed paints. Wink wink, nudge nudge. These kinds of white lines I add on the characters is a way to add highlights, really. Since I use it all the time in my comic, my drawings usually feel very empty without them to me, so I almost automatically always add them. I almost always shade things in the same order when I do illustrations. I start by shading the skin first, and then move on to all the other things. I like to be organized when I work because I feel it makes me more time efficient when I have a consistent system. That is especially true when I work on a drawing like this that takes several hours to complete. Having a system in this case, and remembering that system, helps me memorize how I shaded certain things if ever I don't finish the drawing in one session, just like this one. It's a pet peeve of mine to be inconsistent in my drawings, and well, sometimes, probably more times than I realize, those inconsistencies slip under the radar, and things like this can happen. This is a little Easter egg from chapter 5, where instead of bang, the onomatopoeia is, well, just simply bag. It's too late to change it now, and it's really just hilarious to me, so I'm sharing it here. Shading white things or almost white things can be pretty fun, since it can be shaded with almost any color really, since it is very directly affected by the color of the light. Here I opted to shade it with a quite warm purple to stay consistent with the warm shading of all of the other elements beforehand. The more I continued working on the drawing, the more I found that leaving the background completely empty and white would be more suitable, because I didn't want it to be too overwhelming to look at. I wanted to make sure that the drawing is straight to the point and clear, since it was to have an important role as an illustration. A somewhat bad habit of mine is that I put a lot of effects on my illustrations. I always feel like my drawings are a bit empty or not good enough as they are, but piling up effects on top of one another can be harmful to the illustration. It ends up making it all look like a wedding cake covered in colorful confetti, burying the main subject. It's something I need to learn to not lean on so much. Here is the end result. I'm really glad I properly sat down and made this drawing. I didn't expect it to turn out as well as it did, given that I started out somewhat aimlessly. Thank you very much to all of my patrons. If you want to see more stuff I do, check out my other video I made not long ago, or follow me on my other social media, links all in the description. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time!